The evils of paper money have no end. That's how Thomas Paine put it, but he was far from alone. The founders and the old revolutionaries were deeply concerned about the dangers of paper money. They understood it well because they lived it firsthand and they told us what to watch for. So on this episode, I'm going to share with you 4 key ways that the founders warned us about the dangers of paper money. Dangers that we're actually still living through today. So I'm going to cite people along with Paine, people like Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, and a few others. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Boldin with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, July 22nd, 2024. Let's get right to it. And I first want to kick it off before we get to these 4 main categories with just some general views from some leading founders and old revolutionaries about the idea of paper money. Here's how Thomas Jefferson put it in a letter to Edward Carrington, May of 1788. "Paper is poverty," wrote Thomas Jefferson. "It is only the ghost of money and not money itself." And Thomas Paine, from that same paper, Dissertations on Government, the Affairs of the Bank, and Paper Money, this was 1786, where he said the evils of paper money have no end. He also pointed out that, well, money is money and paper is paper. All the invention of man cannot make them otherwise. And he also said that, he recognized that some people could use paper notes, but if you're using paper notes as a substitution, paper as a substitution for what is actually money, for Paine it was gold and silver, maybe even copper. If you're using the notes as a substitution rather than as a representation of, then that's a different story. He said the only use proper for paper in the room of money is to write promissory notes and obligations of payment in specie upon. So again, paper can't be money. Money is money. Paper can be a promissory note. It can have other purposes. Benjamin Rush, in a letter to John Adams, thought that paper money would just distorted all kinds of things. And I'm going to get into that view from people like Jefferson and others a little bit later in the show. But he said paper money is the bane of our morals and characters. And Richard Henry Lee, in a letter to, I think this is George Mason, he said, "Knaves assure and fools believe that calling paper money and making it tender is the way to be rich and happy." John Jay, in another quote, he said, "The knaves and fools of this world are forever in alliance." So it's the people who will fall for garbage going along in alliance with the knaves who want to manipulate the population into doing stuff that they really shouldn't be doing, basically harming their own liberty, their own prosperity. And so Richard Henry Lee is taking that position here as well. Like, look, there's knaves who tell us that paper is money and fools believe it. That's in a letter to George Mason in 1787. So let's get to these 4 key ways that the founding generation told us that, well, paper money causes all kinds of evil. First of all, it's the cause of price inflation. Now, what most people today cause inflation, the founders actually called depreciation. They rarely use the term inflation. Depreciation was a common term. It was widely understood because they recognized that across the board price increases were not just due to bad guys trying to rip people off. They were a result of money having less value, less purchasing power, and it got that way by having too much of it. Once you increase the supply of money, it has less purchasing power. They understood this. Certainly, they saw it play out in practice. I've got some examples of how it did as well. Here's Benjamin Franklin of the Paper Money of America in 1780. He clearly learned quite a bit by this point. He said, "It has been long and often observed that when the current money of a country is augmented beyond the occasions for money as a medium of commerce, its value as money diminishes, its interest is reduced, and the principal sinks if some means are not found to take off the surplus quantity." So he's recognizing here as early as 1780 that as you increase the supply of money, the purchasing power goes less, and that means stuff costs more. We see this happen all around us today, certainly, but yet people are just still confused about the evils of this deluge of paper money that we've lived under for so long. Samuel Adams understood this as well in a letter to John Winthrop the year prior, 1779. He said, everybody to Samuel Adams, sees that the depreciation of the paper currency is owing to the floods of it, which have been necessarily issued. So they recognized, they all kind of took the position like this is what we had to do to fight this long, bloody war against the British. There was one point when Benjamin Franklin was even writing, because he was in London, he's even writing that people here can't understand how we're out of money and we're still able to continue fighting this war. You thought you could drain us of resources, but that didn't work too well. So Samuel Adams took a similar position, but also recognized that it was depreciating paper currency that has resulted in bad stuff because of the floods of money. He said the lessening the quantity in circulation is the only means of restoring the value and credit of the remainder. That was Samuel Adams in 1779. Governor Morris in a letter to George Washington, 1796, the year he stepped down, his farewell address later that year. In proportion to the increase of that medium, he's talking about paper, or the decrease of commodities which it represents, so inflation, inflating the money supply, including in these debts for which it is a tender, the prices will rise, or the money lose of its value. Again, it's increase the money supply, lower the purchasing power, prices of everything go up. Today, they like to tell us that an ice cream costs too much because the ice cream company is just a bunch of bad guys. They don't want to make a profit. They want to just charge so much that hardly anyone can afford it. This is the mentality that they want us to fall for. This is what the knaves want us to be fools about. Now, in 1786, first, before getting to Thomas Jefferson explaining the history of how this played out, here's a letter to Thomas Jefferson from William Fleming, pointing out that provisions and all kinds of goods rise in proportion to the depreciation of the paper money. Again, this was a widely understood view. That doesn't mean everybody was on board with getting rid of paper money. There was certainly some resistance to that in places like Rhode Island, at least by the time of the Constitution, but that's another episode. Here is 1786, Thomas Jefferson explaining the history of how this played out. He said, in 2 years, the price had fallen to $2 of paper. So they first introduced this paper, and he's like, okay, people were exchanging it because this was kind of a novel thing for them. They were exchanging it, and the paper held the value kind of 1-to-1 for gold and silver, what it was equivalent. But in 2 years, it dropped down to $2 of paper for 1 of silver. In 3 years, it went to 4-to-1. In 9 months more, it went to 10-for-1. So once it starts expanding, just like government power, it is like a cancer. It grows faster and faster every single hour. That's how John Adams put it back when he was one of the good guys in 1775. But the same thing with introducing fiat paper money. Backed by nothing, not 1-to-1, just the paper is the money instead of a promissory note, as Thomas Paine said the only use of it is. So in 9 months more, so 1 year, it was equal. 2 years, down to 2-to-1. 3 years, 4-to-1. 9 more months, 10-to-1. And then the 6 months following, he said that is to say by September of 1779, it had fallen to 20-to-1. So what you were able to purchase for $1 with the paper money in a matter, I guess I can't do the math. I went to government-run school, so this is like let's say like 3.5 years, somewhere around that. Your $1 was worth 1/20th of a dollar. You needed 20 additional dollars to purchase the same thing. He said Congress, alarmed at the consequences which were to be apprehended should they lose this resource together. So now they're saying, this is getting out of control. We did this as kind of an emergency measure, but look at all these other problems it's causing. They thought it necessary to make a vigorous effort to stop its further depreciation. So they did some things. They passed some laws. They urged people to do certain things. And they didn't play out too well. He said they therefore published an address to their constituents in which they renewed their original declaration that this paper money should be redeemed at dollar for dollar. Like, okay, everybody, I know the market is telling you that this stuff is only worth 1/20th of an actual dollar of silver, but we're telling you, you should redeem it at 1-to-1. And of course, we shouldn't be surprised. They proved the ability of the states to do this and that their liberty would be cheaply bought at that price, but the declaration was ineffectual. No man received the money at a better rate. On the contrary, 6 months more, it got worse. And he said by March 1780, it fell to 40-to-1. So Congress tried to take another step. So it went all the way down to 1/40th of a dollar just in 6 months later, from 20-to-1 to 40-to-1. Congress is passing stuff telling people to do certain things, and the market is more powerful than government. Congress, he said, then tried an experiment of a different kind. Considering their former offers to redeem this money at par, so 1-to-1, as relinquished by the general refusal to take it but in progressive depreciation, They required the whole to be brought in, declared it should be redeemed at its present value of 40 to 1. So now they're like, okay, well, we're not stopping this train. It's getting worse and worse and worse. And if it continues to depreciate, we're going to not have the ability to pay for this war. We're going to lose. They were freaking out at this point. Uh-oh, I'm scrolling over here. He said, and that so its present value, they're like, okay, turn it all in. We'll do 40 to 1. And they would give to the holders new bills, reduced in their domination to the sum of gold or silver, which was actually to be paid for them, kind of like a promissory note. But he's like, even that didn't work. He said this effort was as unavailing as the former. And I think this is an example of how once you let the fiat money system introduce itself, it'll always get worse and worse and worse until it completely breaks down. And efforts to fix it rather than have it just break down and just get rid of it completely and start with real sound money, they just don't work. And this is at least how it played out in 1780. He said, this effort was unavailing as the former. Very little of the money was brought in. They're offering them new notes. They're going to pay them. They're promising them specie, all this stuff. It continued to circulate and to depreciate till the end of 1780 when it had fallen to 75 for 1. So you had a 75% decrease in just around 4 years, maybe less than that. 75% decrease in purchasing power. Now, we've seen, maybe not the same here today, but we've seen some massive price inflation. They call it inflation, but that's so we misdirect our anger about what's going on away from the people printing the money, people spending so much money that they shouldn't spend in government, so that empowers or gives an excuse to have them print more money, because without all these programs, people are going to die in the streets, of course. Got to keep printing the money. This is causing a massive devaluation as well. And again, if you think about telling people they weren't allowed to work, they weren't allowed to conduct business, small businesses had to shut down for periods of years, and then paying people to stay at home with printed money, we shouldn't be surprised that things are kind of spiraling out of control, no matter how they tried to describe it today. So Jefferson clearly pointed out that this was a bad thing. Now, I'm going to have all this stuff linked to in the show notes. We publish a blog post for every single episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. I'm just reading small quotes here and there, but these letters and papers are super interesting. They're super educational, and if you can read and learn more in context on your own time, you're going to be far better at explaining this stuff than I ever will be, because you're going to spend more time on it than I do. I'm going to jump to the next topic in a couple of days, but I do my best, of course, to do as good a job as possible in telling the story through the founder's words as possible on this show. Now, Alan Mosley does an awesome job organizing the blog post for every episode, and he'll have a show links section plus all the different platforms we're on in case we're missing from one someday, in case somebody says, hey, we don't like what you're having to say, this is now bad speech, we got to get rid of it. You'll be able to find all the different platforms around. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and X and Twitch and LinkedIn and Facebook. We also live stream over at rumble.com and odyssey.com. I love the community growing on these so-called alt platforms. We also have the audio-only podcast edition all over the place. Basically, everywhere we try to be everywhere possible. Spotify, Apple, Podbean. If we're missing from your favorite platform, please let us know, whether in the comments or email team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I don't get a chance to reply to too many of them, but I certainly do my best to read through all of them, and I got a lot of great ideas and suggestions for future episodes as well. But while I'm here, I want to take another just quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. It looks like Mafia Matters, which is a good screen name over on Rumble. It says, paper enables central planning, steals power from we the people. Is that essentially Statham in a nutshell? 100%, absolutely correct. Dennis Marburger, Brewster, and a few other people, I'm sure. There's Gringazzo, Gatto, and Gypsy over on Rumble. And then on Facebook and YouTube and a few other places, there's Dan and Don and Kirk and Howard. John D. Liberto, good to see you, been a while. Haji and Floyd. Again, I know I'm skipping over a few people, but I wanted to give a quick shout out to a few of those that I was able to scroll by and see and say thank you so much for being here. But let's get back to this. So we're talking about the 4 key areas where the founding generation told us that paper money caused all kinds of evil. The evils of paper money, as Thomas Paine put it, have no end. Of course, the first thing is that it manipulates prices. The more that you print, the higher that the prices go of all kinds of goods and services. It manipulates the markets completely. It is depreciation of the currency that we experience, not price inflation due to nasty corporations trying to kill us all. That's absurd. They're just trying to be really rich. Maybe they go out. That's another discussion. So number two is that it empowers government, just like our great comment over there on Rumble. I see so many of them. And Thomas Jefferson, in that same paper explaining things in 1786, explained why they did all of that printing. And it's because the government needed to be able to do stuff. Now, of course, they all justified it because they were fighting this war against the British Empire. But of course, once you allow them to do something like that, you shouldn't be surprised when they come back and try to do it again and again and again and again. And certainly, as people are confused about the source of the problem, then they're okay with the wrong solution. So just as a quick aside, some people who tell us that a CBDC is the most dangerous thing on earth. And, there's a lot of most dangerous things on earth. And I agree that a central bank digital currency is a tool to establish a total tyranny. But the solution to a central bank digital currency isn't to use the fiat money of the empire. The paper money is the foundation for it. We have to use real money, sound money, not the garbage that they keep throwing at us. That's the foundation for the next step. So that's misunderstanding the source of the problem. The source of the problem is that people have been willing and accepting of something other than real money. Just like Thomas Paine put it, paper is paper and money is money. All the invention of man can't put it otherwise. Here's Jefferson. He said, previous to the late Revolution, most of the states were in the habit, whenever they had occasion for more money than could be immediately raised by taxes, to issue paper notes or bills in the name of the state, wherein they promised to pay the bearer the sum named in the note or bill. So they were using it supposedly as a promissory note, but as soon as you start doing that, he pointed out that some of them did it one-to-one, others didn't really make a date, anything specific like that, so it really didn't act as a promissory note. It really acted more just like its own money. And again, the underlying message here that Jefferson is recognizing is that when they couldn't raise enough money by taxes, when you have a hard limit of the physical amount of money that government is able to raise and therefore spend, they can't go into this whole deficit world. They have to tax more. And sooner or later, if you try to take 70, 80% from people to keep the size of government the way it is, the more that you try to take from them, the more they're going to be resistant to it. So what do? They fire up the printing press that gives them more money than they would have otherwise. And then maybe if it depreciates in value a little bit later, they print a little bit more. They try to get it under control like we see today. That's what Jefferson is recognizing here as well. He said, on the commencement of the late Revolution, Congress had no money. The external commerce of the states being suppressed, the farmer could not sell his produce, and of course, could not pay a tax. Congress had no resource then but in paper money. But that paper money, as he pointed out in this same section, a succinct account of paper money, he pointed out that as soon as they did this, it lost value so quickly. In less than 4 years, or maybe around 4 years, give or take, it lost 75% of its value. It certainly was going to get even worse and worse and worse over time. Even though they took it as a necessary evil, it certainly was an evil. Here's Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who I don't cite too often, but pretty cool. Brad Berzer wrote a book on him. I got to meet him when we were both in Tom Woods' wedding a couple of years ago. But here he is in a letter to Benjamin Franklin in August of 1777. He said, the finances of Congress, depending wholly on emissions of paper money, were exhausted. Its credit was gone. The time I am now speaking of is the latter end of the year 1780. So again, this is a reiteration of the fact that paper money is used as a tool to empower government that cannot raise money the old-fashioned way, which is knocking down doors, beating on heads, and taking money through taxation or theft, whatever we want to call it. So it empowers government, and it empowers government by acting as number two, a hidden tax. And here's Benjamin Franklin of the paper money in America in 1780 once again. So just the short version, when government is too big for its old school style revenues, it either has to reduce its size and scope, or it has to raise taxes, collect more taxes. Or their other option, which they got real smart about, was inflate the money supply. And inflation, used properly, defined properly, is an increase in the supply of money and credit. That's real inflation. The result is price increases. Well, that's why we like to call it here the same thing the founders did, depreciation. So this acts as a tax on the people, because if they're not able to tax them directly, this is kind of a tricky way, sneaky way of including a hidden or gradual tax. And that's how Benjamin Franklin put it as well. He said, "My greatest apprehensions arise from the depreciation of our paper money. If we emit more bills of credit, they will fall to nothing. We cannot tax to the amount of the charges of war and of our civil establishments. We must then raise money by lotteries and by borrowing." Oh, that's Benjamin Franklin in a letter to Charles. Oh, that's the letter to Charles Carroll of Carrollton. The other was Thomas Paine. Wow, man, I am jumping ahead here. So where the finances of Congress, depending wholly on emissions of paper money, were exhausted, the credit was gone. That's Thomas Paine writing to George Washington. Here's Charles Carroll writing to Benjamin Franklin, talking about how they were using the money they can't tax enough, so they have to print. And here's Benjamin Franklin. He said, "The general effect of the depreciation among the inhabitants of the states has been this, that it has operated as a gradual tax upon them. Their business has been done and paid for by the paper money, and every man has paid his share of this tax according to the time he retained any of the money in his hands." Think about it. If money depreciates so quickly to go 2 to 1 to 10 to 1 to 20 to 1 and 40 to 1 to 75 to 1 in just a matter of years, this discourages savings. So if you try to save your money and you know it's only going to purchase 1/10 or 1/50th, you're more likely to just blow the cash immediately, spend it as quickly as you can before it has no value. And that's why so many people, of course, try to put their money in something that can hold value, like real money. So their business has been done and paid for by the paper money. Every man has paid his share of this tax according to the time he retained any of the money in his hand and to the depreciation within that time. Thus, it has proved a tax on money. And in a letter to Governor Morris, or to George Washington from Governor Morris, he said again, this is in 1778, "The depreciation in 1778 in the interim hath operated as a tax." We often think of people like Ron Paul today who refer to inflation as the inflation tax. You can hear this from people at the Mises Institute, of course, Mises.org, Peter Schiff on his podcast pretty regularly, many other people in the sound money effort out there. They totally recognize that inflation is a hidden tax. It's a very nefarious one because people aren't really aware that they're being taxed. It's a ripoff, really, on a grand scale. But they certainly recognized this at the time of the founding, during the Revolution as well, Benjamin Franklin, Governor Morris, and others. So our third one is that it operates as a hidden tax. So it causes price inflation. It empowers government. It does so by acting as a hidden tax. And the last one is that it really facilitates every species of fraud and injustice. And that's how George Washington put it. I'll get to that in just a moment. But here's again Thomas Paine from his dissertations in 1786. It manipulates markets, it facilitates fraud and injustice, and he said one of the evils of paper money is that it turns the whole country into stock jobbers. The precariousness of its value and the uncertainty of its fate continually operate night and day to produce this destructive effect. Having no real value in itself, it depends for support upon accident, caprice, and party, and it is in the interest of some to depreciate and of others to raise its value. There is a continual invention going on that destroys the morals of the country. So the more that you have the paper money, the more that you're going to have people fighting for control of it. And we wonder why so many people want to control the levers of power today. because we live in this type of a system that Thomas Paine and so many others warned us about. Thomas Jefferson in 1819 also pointed out, he took the position that having a paper money system encourages people to take on far more debt than they would under a real sound money system. And then if you add things like a central bank that manipulates interest rates, they don't let the market allow interest rates to rise as they would naturally, and they keep them low or they keep them at zero for years and years and years, that certainly makes credit much easier. Oh, it's so much easier to take a loan on this, to buy a big ticket item that I can't actually afford, and so therefore it distorts the market. Here's how Jefferson put it. The plethora, this is archaic term, plethoras, I guess, the plethora of circulating medium, which raised the prices of everything to several times their ordinary and standard value, in which the state of things, many and heavy debts were contracted. So this causes a lot more debt. Here he is again in a letter to Albert Gallatin in 1820. He said, "At home things are not well. The flood of paper money, as you well know, had produced an exaggeration of nominal prices and at the same time a facility of obtaining money, which not only encouraged speculations on fictitious capital, but seduced those of real capital, even in private life, to contract debts too freely." So it makes it seem like it's a fake wealth that flows around, and eventually it all comes crashing down. George Washington, in a letter to Jabez Bowen in Rhode Island, where certainly there was opposition to ratification of the Constitution because of their support for paper money. Now, many times we can say the Anti-Federalists were right, but some of the Anti-Federalists, not all of them, some of them were in favor of the paper money system, which they were wrong about. But here's how George Washington put it. He said, "Paper money has had the effect in your state that it ever will have, to ruin commerce, oppress the honest, and open a door to every species of fraud and injustice." Man, that really hammers it home in my mind. I guess we could have done the whole episode just with one quote from George Washington there. But we also have John Adams in a discussion back and forth when they became frenemies, I guess, once again later in life. Back and forth in 1819. They were discussing in some letters in February and March of that year Destutt de Tracy's Treatise on Political Economy, which Thomas Jefferson was a big fan of this work. You can find it for free online at Liberty Fund. I believe Online Library of Liberty has it available for free. I don't have a link handy for it here, but if we get a chance, we'll include it in the show notes. Otherwise, I'm sure you can use your favorite search and find that. But it was really a foundational text in the early 19th century that many in the founding generation, people like Jefferson, of course, this was on free markets. It was a leading text on that. But here's John Adams commenting on this book that Jefferson urged him to read. He said, "At present, I will acknowledge one great obligation to it. That is the chapter 6th of Money, page 21. Quote, when these denominations are admitted and employed in transaction, to diminish the quantity of metal to which they answer by an alteration of the real coins, is to steal. A theft of greater magnitude and still more ruinous is the making of paper." So Tracy is taking the position that if you shave down a coin, this is robbing people. And then even worse than that, worse than inflating the money supply, because we can go to empires of old and say, okay, well, they said this was 1 ounce of gold. Well, they shaved off a little bit and they minted more gold and pretended that it was 1 ounce. But that is robbery. Of course, governments will do that. But they say here, Tracy is saying, even more ruinous is paper. He said it is greater because in this money, there is absolutely no real value. There is nothing. Paine also said that as well. It is more ruinous because it is by its gradual depreciation during all the time of its existence, it produces the effect which would be produced by an infinity of successive deteriorations of the coin. That's John Adams in his letter to Thomas Jefferson, citing this book, Tracy, his treatise on political economy. But Adams adds his own commentary here as well. He said, that is to say, an infinity of successive felonious larcenies. It wasn't good enough just refer to it as a deterioration of the coin, this printing of paper money. He's saying this is a series of felonious larcenies. He said, if this is true, as I believe it is, We Americans are the most thievish people that ever existed. We have been stealing from each other for 150 years. So for John Adams, this was a robbery of a massive scale. Thomas Jefferson certainly agreed as well. It is much, much worse today. Jefferson wrote back, he said, "I'm delighted with your high approbation of Tracy's book." But he had a caveat. He said, "The evils of this deluge of paper money are not to be removed until our citizens are generally and radically instructed in their cause and consequences." Well, we're still facing the cause and consequence today. It's certainly much, much worse than even at that time. So I'm not sure who needs to hear this message, but I think all of us do. Those of us who are familiar with it, we need to hear it and rehear it and share it with as many people as possible. And that's why we work so hard every single day here at the 10th Amendment Center to get this kind of important foundational information from the founding generation out to more and more people. And absolutely nothing helps us get the job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. We're talking about dirty government fiat. And if you got a couple of bucks of it, $2 a month, our membership program, consider throwing some of it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We use it to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, whether the government likes it or not. We certainly punch way above our weight class, and they certainly don't like that. We've been attacked by left and right in the establishment. We will continue to get that because you don't catch flack unless you're over the target. So we've got our membership program over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members for as little as $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment to say a huge thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us as members in the last week or so. There's Carrie here in California. Thank you. Christopher in Washington. Don in Nevada. Or is it Nevada? I apologize. Whatever way it's supposed to be. Susan in South Carolina. Anthony in Florida. And Bradley in Ohio. And everyone else, I'm very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us as a member. You can also donate a one-time donation over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. Please continue leaving comments, whether it's live or in the archive. You can also smash the like button, leave us a review on Apple Podcast or any other podcast platform. Leaving comments, sharing links, all that stuff will help trigger the algorithms of some of these mainstream platforms and tell them to show us to more people. We are reaching more and more people than I ever thought possible, but we're still barely scratching the surface. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your help. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.